Hello, and thank you for tuning in to the Flatiron Syndicate Motorsports Podcast. This show is brought to you by Flatiron's Tuning, your source for any aftermarket or OEM Subaru parts. Be sure to check out our store at flatironstuning.com and stay tuned with Flatiron's Tuning. Welcome back, everybody, to the Flatiron Syndicate Podcast. I'm here today with a man who needs no introduction, Tanner Smith, aka Smeedia, back on the podcast. And Tanner, I reached out and I apologize. I meant to get you back on sooner. I think last we talked, you were just about or had just gotten the six-cylinder swap working in the STI.
Mhm.
Wanted to kind of bring you back on and talk about how that all went. And now the news is out. The cat is out of the bag that you've decided, well, I'm going to go in a different direction. So I was like, oh, I got to get you on before it all goes and changes so we can kind of talk through what happened.
Right. Oh, how the tides have turned and things have changed. Yeah, so it's been wild. So there's a couple engine setups later, couple different setups going on and dyno sessions and changes. I mean, that's how it goes with a lot of that stuff when you try to venture off the path of what people normally do is it's a lot of
Yeah.
trial and error with that stuff. And it just at the end of the day, it just didn't work out. We just kept running into different. It was never like a singular same problem that we always ran into. It was always different ones.
Yeah. And
So
I,
I
one of the questions I was thinking of about this is let's go back to the point where you decided you were going to put the six-cylinder in. Can
mhm.
you kind of what was some of the criteria that the six-cylinder EG33 met that you decided, okay, I'm going to go down this path? What were you trying to achieve?
So the six cylinder idea originally just started with like I was doing a live stream and we are just joking around putting a six cylinder in the car. And then somehow that became a reality. And I remember I went on YouTube, Google, all these places, because there was the EZ30, EZ36, and the EG33 for me to pick from Subaru's six cylinder lineup. I know they had like the ones in the XT6s and things like that. That wasn't even on my radar at the time. So it was either
Yeah.
EG33, EZ30, or EZ36. And when I went into this, I had no idea. Like I figured all of it out as I went. I didn't know exactly what I was doing when I originally started this. So I was
Okay.
like, oh, it can't be that hard. We can figure it out. I mean, we did figure it out for the most part, but when I was originally looking, like I said, it was EG33, EZ30, EZ36, and I stumbled across Subi Performance's video. They're out in, I believe, Germany,
Oh
and
yeah.
I was watching one of their things, and they had all three engines lined up on a table, and they were like, the big factor that I went with the EG33 specifically is because the cylinder liners were thicker than the 3 liter and the 3.6 liter. The 3.6 liter and the 3 liter are both they're physically the same size engine. So you have to give up some cylinder wall there or some cylinder liner to be able to compensate for the displacement difference. So I was like 36 off the table. Don't want that because I was like, I want to try to push this thing as far as I can. So it was down to the 3 liter and the 3.3. I went for the EG because it shared a lot of similarities with the EJ25 systems. So I could take a
Right.
lot of the EJ25 stuff and use it over on an EG. Little did I know you can still use some EJ stuff on EZs also. I just didn't know that at the time. So
Hmm.
that was kind of my main reason for going with like the EG33, which if I could go back and slap myself, I'd go with the EZ30, mainly
Hmm.
because it's still a supported engine. It's not a 30-year-old engine like the EG is, and Subaru still produces parts for them. You can still get plenty of aftermarket support. Haltech supports them way more than the EG stuff. So I'm kicking
Right.
myself for going with that older engine. It was fantastic engine though. EGs are great engines when they're set up and they're dialed and they're working properly,
Yeah.
but they're old, which that's one of the
Yeah.
problems.
And it was only in one platform. It was only in the SVX, and they didn't sell. That was not like a huge.
And it was only for like 4 years that 4 or 5 years that they manufactured them.
It was it was a little long. I think it was 91 to 98, 97 or 98.
Yeah,
But
so
again,
it
they
wasn't
did
in
not
long
sell
run.
many.
Yeah.
No. And I mean like the EZ30, the 36, those were in like Outbacks and stuff. Like
Hmm.
there's hundreds of thousands of Outbacks out there, and a lot of
Yeah.
those got the six cylinders. So there's a lot more to pick from. Yeah, so better support. So and you said you wanted to push. Like that was not only did you want to do the engine swap, but that was kind of the initial goal was you wanted to and the displacement, but then also push kind of the threshold and try and
Yeah.
make a lot of power with it too, right?
Yeah, because I remember when I first started it, I was watching a lot of like the Andy Forrest stuff when he did the
Hmm.
EG. At the time, I didn't realize how different our budgets were.
Oh, sure, sure.
I did not realize how different our budgets were between a dude trying to do this at home and someone who's going all out with these things. So yeah, I wanted to try to push as far as I could. And I mean, I feel like I pushed it. We just got on the brink of 1,000 horsepower on the last dyno tuning session. So I
Right.
feel like I was able to push it pretty far. I mean, granted, they're capable of doing more. It's just how
Yeah.
much more money do you want to spend?
Yeah. I mean, it's and 1,000 horsepower is it's bananas. I mean, it seems like it's more attainable now than it used to be because there's more paths
Hmm.
to making a Subaru that makes, in that ballpark of power than there used to be, even back when you started, really.
Yeah.
But that's still like that's a lot. That's way different than what that engine did. That's five times. Because I want to say that the SVX was like 230 horsepower is what it was rated at, give or
Somewhere
take.
right around that range. Yeah. And I was talking
Yeah.
with Jeremy over at Outfront the other day because I was discussing some ideas, engine options with him and
Mhm.
whatnot. And because we were revving that thing out we were going to 9,500 RPM on that engine. And
Wow.
he told me, he was like, if you would have told somebody back in the early 2000s that you were pushing an EG33 out to 9,500 RPM, they wouldn't believe you. I'm like, no,
No.
no one would believe you. Now, granted, there were things in the setup that I needed to change to be able to achieve those RPMs a little more reliably and effectively, which is my fault. But it just comes down to that cost aspect again. The car needed a dry sump, funny enough, to be able to maintain those oil pressures because
Oh yeah.
I tried so many. That was one of the problems that I kept running into is oil pressure would drop above 7,000 RPM.
Yeah.
I tried 12 millimeter pumps, RCM 12 millimeter pumps, ported and shimmed 12 millimeter pumps, 11 millimeter pumps, ported and shimmed 11 millimeter pumps, stock oil pans, stock baffles, aftermarket pans, aftermarket baffles. And it's
Yeah.
just, we couldn't keep that oil pressure above 7,000. It would just plummet from about 95 psi down to 35 to 40 every
Oof.
single time.
Yeah, that's rough. Well, and there's a lot of differences in this. Like when you're that's I guess that's one of the differences between like building on an existing engine and platform
Mm-hmm.
versus putting in a different engine and starting from like a completely different like sandbox to kind of put together a build.
Yeah.
And was this the first time that you kind of did that outside of the box swap into a car?
It's my first
I
engine
think it
swap
was.
I've ever done.
Yeah.
Ever.
So,
I had an old Datsun a long time ago that I did an RB25 in, but the chassis was rusted and I ended up giving up on that project because there's too
okay.
many things that it was just not feasible at the time. So this was my first, I guess I should say, successful engine swap I've done.
Okay. Okay. So you must have learned a lot from
I
you
learned a
you
ton.
you've undoubtedly learned a ton. So what are some like maybe the top things on your mind like as you're looking at doing another engine swap into this or like you've got the RX-7 that I
Mhm.
want to ask you about later where you've kind of thought about going outside the box then kind of back to the rotary and all that. What are some of your criteria for deciding like do I want to stay with this engine or do I want to put in some engine from a different platform in the car?
OEM and aftermarket support are the biggest ones
Mm,
that I look at now. With because I'm glad I did the EG because it taught me way more because it is unfortunately it is I hate to say it and SVX owners are going to get mad at me for saying it, but it's a dying platform. It's a dying platform.
yeah.
And going into another swap, base criteria is it still has to be able to have OEM manufactured parts and it has to have some type of decent aftermarket support. It doesn't have to have like all these crazy like bolt-on turbo kits or any of this stuff, but even with just like aftermarket standalone engine management, it has to have some type of support. And granted, there was some in the Haltech when I went and I started doing this, but whenever I'd call Haltech, and I'd have to call Haltech Australia every single time because every time
Hmm.
I called USA, they wouldn't be able to help me at all. So I'd call over there. Great guy. I think Scotty is his name. I
Okay.
might have it wrong. He helped me numerous times. He remoted in from Australia when I was first trying to get the swap running.
Oh
Took
wow.
over my laptop and was fantastic support with the Haltech guys. But when it comes to like the EMS or the engine management stuff with Haltech, the like the EZ30 and EZ36 are way more supported. They have even just on like the wiring loom side of things, they offer more support for it. And like that was one of the things that I'm grateful for with the EG33 is like I didn't understand vehicle electronics at all up until this engine swap when I had to build
Right.
an engine harness from scratch. And I did it twice. The first time I did it looked like it was awful. It was just terrible. I took Haltech's flying lead harness and I just kind of made it work. I did
Right.
just plugged into the ECM and I just ran it all through the firewall and it just looked like spaghetti. It was just a terrible spaghetti engine harness, but it worked.
Okay.
And the second one, that's when I started watching a lot of the HPA classes and I went on race spec and I started ordering like firewall connectors, tough cell wiring, all like the epoxy and like the proper DR25. And I actually built like an actual harness I was like proud of, and it worked fantastic. So it's just the engines going forward when doing these swaps have to have more support. And granted, like there are older engines out there produced in the same era as the EG33, but they have way more OE and aftermarket support still.
Yeah. And this is, I mean, support means what you would think. It's just like aftermarket parts and OEM parts. Like if you're going to need OEM sensors, OEM gaskets, like things just to get the engine
Water
put
pumps,
together,
things like
water
that. Like
pump.
you
Yeah.
can't buy OEM EG33 water pumps anymore.
Yeah.
There,
Yeah.
and I assume timing components will start disappearing soon. Like
Yeah.
I have a giant tote at my shop full of OEM EG33 parts because I would stockpile them. Every time I'd have to order something, I would order bulk like 2 or 3x what I needed. So that way in the future, if I needed them
Yeah.
again, I have a stash.
Yeah. And that's as cars get older, that's one of the interesting aspects because for whatever reason, and we've talked about it on the podcast a couple times too, is that Subaru is not supporting those older platforms as much as they once did.
Yeah.
And when stuff is unique, like on the EG33, like where they only use certain parts, like the water pumps, like the oil pump, the oil pump's been
Mhm.
discontinued for a long time, so you have to kind of makeshift something to work.
Yeah, I
Just
don't
keeping the
know
car
how
running.
SVX owners are still doing it with stock ECUs.
Yeah,
I have no idea when it comes to those oil pumps
yeah,
because they run off of if people don't know, the stock SVX runs off of two crank position sensors.
hmm
And the oil pumps, while yes, an EJ oil pump will bolt on and it will work, you have to have a standalone in order to be able to make it work.
yeah,
Otherwise, you're only going to be running one crank sensor when it needs two.
yeah. The factories you wouldn't read it. Yeah,
Yeah.
it's and there's some of the cam or is it crank position sensor? No, the cam position sensor or something like that. There's a couple of the sensors that are critical to function that Subaru's just discontinued. You can't get them anymore.
Yeah.
Lots of stuff like that. And that's a big hurdle. Um, if you're trying to build this car, and especially if you're trying to make power, things will happen, things will break. Heck, even if you just want to go in there and do normal maintenance sometimes, like if just doing normal maintenance is a challenge because
Hmm.
the parts aren't available, that's that makes it harder.
Yeah,
Yeah.
with like on the very first time I had the car in the dyno, we ended up breaking a cam. One of the exhaust
Oh
cams
yeah.
broke, and
Mhm.
that was another thing. You can't just buy a cam. So I had to buy an entire second engine to get this one camshaft I needed, and then have it reground into a 280 cam from Delta again. So it's like
Uh-huh.
that's the hard stuff with those engines. It's like you can't just order a replacement part. You
Yeah.
have to either find someone who's parting one out, find someone else who has a stash, buy a whole second engine so you have spare parts, and
Yeah.
it's
Yeah.
cumbersome.
Yeah. And I mean, if you love the platform, and there are people out there with SVXs that do, I get it. But
Mm-hmm.
like friend of the podcast, Jeremy, he's been on a couple times. He has three SVXs so that he can keep the one good one running. Like he's
Yep.
got two parts cars that he grabs from to keep the thing running, which
That's
is
that's normally how I see most SVX owners. They don't have one,
yeah,
they have a couple, so that way they got spares.
yeah. Well, and can you talk a little bit more about what you said with the wiring side? Because like I mean, going to a standalone, if you're building a race car, if you're going really outside the box, going to a standalone is probably something that you're going to have to at least consider.
Yeah.
But what is the difference in your opinion from having like kind of let's call it plug and play support from a standalone manufacturer versus like here's the ECU, here's a big old loom of wires, you
Mhm.
guys just have fun.
So it's funny because I can compare my EG over to my RX-7. Funny enough, because the RX-7, that's what I did is I bought an off the
Hmm.
shelf aftermarket engine harness for it, and I hate it. I
Oh,
absolutely hate it because with the EG, when it came to me making an engine harness, I can wire map out everything. I can put things where I want
yeah,
them. I have the options to be able to make wire lengths different. I have the option of putting service loops and connectors if I need to. So that way in the future, if you ever have to repair something, you have a little bit of extra wire in the service loop. So like when it came to wiring it, and it looks so scary the first time you do it. I get like for the people out there that want to make an engine harness for the first time or they have to, like in my case, I didn't have an option. I had to make
right.
one or pay somebody else to make one. But if you're paying somebody else to make one, you're spending thousands of dollars to have a custom engine
Yeah.
harness made. So, like I said, the first time I did it, I just ran the loom through the stock firewall grommet. And then the second time when I built a harness, I got a little more fancy with it and I got the actual auto sport connectors. and
Hmm.
I got the firewall plate so that way I could actually disconnect the engine harness from the bulkhead versus having to go into the car, disconnect it from the ECU, feed it all back through the firewall just to take the engine harness out. So when it comes to it, you have to wire map everything out multiple
Hmm.
times to make sure that you have proper wire lengths, everything's going where it needs to. You have to color code everything also. To an extent, you can use some of Haltech's wiring, but while it does get the job done and it's good wiring, I kind of prefer to not use those flying lead harnesses anymore just because they're all silicone based wiring versus Tefzel, where the Tefzel will hold up to heat,
Mm.
chemical, all that stuff a little bit better. I mean, it's going to be protected with DR25 or some type of loom sheathing, anyways. It's just that extra added layer of protection that's in there.
Okay.
Plus, it's a little bit stiffer. So it's nice to be able to have it so that way if you need to contort it, you contort it while building and it'll kind of retain its shape a little bit more. But I mean, with the plug and play ones, it makes life so much easier for most people out there who don't want to go down the rabbit hole of spending all this money on wire because the tools are the biggest thing you're going to spend money on. Not necessarily the
Oh, yeah.
wire or the connectors, but it's going to be the tools because
Okay.
most of these tools are only good for very specific crimps that you're going to be doing, like Deutsch connectors. I have like 5 different sizes of Deutsch connector crimps because they're all different size plugs and only one of them will fit
Oh,
in each receptacle size. So the biggest money you're going to spend on wiring, doing it yourself, is the tooling side of things, in my opinion. Um,
yeah.
Mapping everything out, labeling everything, making sure that's all sorted. It's taking that mess of spaghetti that a lot of people
Yeah.
see and then organizing it all and making it go and do what you want it to. Because you also have to take into consideration like specific sensors will need 12 volts, 5 volts, 8 volts, a signal ground, a cylinder head ground, or their AVI or their DPO. And if you don't know what those are, it's digital pulsed outputs, analog voltage inputs, and all these different things. And only certain sensors or only certain solenoids will use
Yeah.
certain ones. So it's like there's a lot to learn going into it, but I don't want to say once you do one, you kind of figure it out because it took me a couple times to get it
Yeah.
figured out. But once you do it enough, you start to figure it out a little bit more.
On that wiring side, what it sounds like, and we've kind of gotten a glimpse of that here too, is that you have to decide like how custom are you willing to go and how
Mm-hmm.
custom do you want to go with the wiring? Because,
Yeah.
one of the factors for us with our race car was we want to add sensor inputs. We,
Mm-hmm.
we want to look at other things. We want to collect certain pieces of data and send them to the ECU. And so like if you want to add stuff like that, go outside the box and you get something that's plug and play, you'd still have to add it, but you'd have to kind of piggyback it, route it in something to the
Yeah.
existing harness or plugs,
That's
which may or
another
may not be easy.
and that's another thing with like standalones that I don't think a lot of people think about when they first get them is the amount of AVI and DPO inputs and outputs that you have because that will limit you on what sensors, the amount of sensors you
Yeah,
can run. Like I wanted to run EMAP, EGT, all of these other sensors, but I didn't have the
yeah,
AVIs in the ECM anymore to be able to accept any more sensors from what I already had. So you have to also kind of think about like what sensors do I need and which ones do I want.
yeah. And to an extent, like how far down that wiring rabbit hole do you want to go? I mean, that's
Yeah.
that. I mean, not only support makes absolute sense, but like is from a wiring standpoint, even just like how custom do you want to go in terms of wiring, that would be a deciding factor too.
Mm-hmm.
Because if you don't really want to go outside the box to this extent, like if you guys at home are listening to this and you're thinking about like all of this, like hundreds of feet of, different colored spaghetti in your garage to try and figure out, what connects to what and what do you want to change, what do you want to keep, what do you want to get rid of, all this sort of stuff. What are the minimum sensors and inputs that you need so that the engine would even run,
Mm-hmm.
which is like that can be something that's challenging to figure out even. If you don't
Yeah.
want to go down that path, then maybe that's one of those indicators. Well, like stick with the existing platform with the existing wiring, and just kind of stay in that sandbox versus go a little
Yeah,
bit
and then
crazy.
the other thing that you have to add on top of that with the wiring stuff is a relay box for your
Yeah.
ignition coils, your injectors, your fans, your fuel
Hmm.
pumps, which complicates the wiring even more because now you have to power a fuse box into that harness also, and then run wires out of the fuse box for 12-volt ground, the 12-volt to the sensors or wherever they're
Yeah.
going for that stuff. So then you have this whole other layer of relays and fuses that you have to make sure that you wire in properly also.
Yeah. It can be a lot. So I mean, beyond that, how much of a factor was the power target? Because I mean, you knew you wanted to push. But when you're looking at the platform, how much did a power target come into the equation?
When I first started it, I had unrealistic expectations, which I feel like a lot of us do the first time we go and do this. We're like, hey, I want all this, and I did all the calculators online and all this stuff. And obviously, real world versus what you're seeing online never always the
Sure.
100%. So when I first went into it, I had unrealistic expectations. I was like, oh, this setup's going to do 1,000 horsepower. It's going to do, and this was on the first setup. It's going to do so much
Yeah.
power. It didn't.
Right.
Ran into issues with that. That's when the flywheel and the crankshaft decided they didn't want to be friends anymore. And
Ah,
those had backed out, which was not a fun time because that ended up shattering the oil pump, which starved the engine of oil and killed that engine. So learned from that, did a diamond shim on the next one with literally all the Loctite I could buy at the store. And thankfully it didn't come off. But
oh boy.
um, with the power target, the second time around, Josh and I were talking, and I was like, whatever it makes, it makes.
Mm,
And that's when some of the issues started to stem up because we couldn't make the car stop making power.
mm,
It continued, and that's why we kept revving it out farther and farther and farther and farther. The car never laid over on the dyno until 9,500 RPM on one specific run. And
mm,
I think that's when, because we bent two valves and we warped the other ones. No
mm,
damage to literally anything else except for the valves and the head gasket.
mm,
And we're like, all right, wherever the car stops making power on the dynos, we'll stop. So that way we're not pushing it all that hard. And it just kept going out up until 9,500. And I feel like on that last run, the exhaust manifold collapsed on the driver's side from a lot of heat and pressure.
whoa.
So the bellow had blown out because it wasn't strapped, and the bellow had collapsed, and the entire manifold kind of went down. And I feel like that's when the exhaust valves on cylinder four kiss the piston,
Hmm.
because the car also never jumped timing. It was never out of time, and it was only the exhaust cam or the exhaust valves on cylinder four that kissed. So we were floating the
Hmm.
valves, and we had SuperTech dual valve sprint. So we had everything head wise with the mechanical bits to make sure that this wouldn't happen. And obviously, it still did happen. But for the
Right.
power target, we're like, we'll just let it go until it doesn't want to make power anymore. We won't push it past that point. And well,
So,
we got to
yeah,
that point and it wasn't happy still.
right. And I just want to clarify for people. So when you're saying tip over, the horsepower is continuing to climb. So you're maybe revving it higher, adding boost, whatever. It just keeps going up, going up, going up. You never
Mm-hmm.
saw it just kind of plateau or dip, and so you figure, well, everything must be working okay. Let's just see if we can go a little bit further, and then it sounds like just everything went haywire on that
Well,
last pull.
I don't think it went haywire because
Okay.
the car still, I drove the car home after that.
Oh wow.
So I drove the car home and I did a track day with it after that. And it was just
Oh.
fine. So it wasn't enough to completely cause the engine to not run. So I drove it home. The following week, I had a fabricator buddy of mine come out and we fixed the exhaust manifold. We built a new piece and we strapped the new bellow so that way it wouldn't blow out again.
Mm-hmm.
And after that, I drove the car around a little bit. I probably put another 200 miles on it. And then I drove it out to the track day that I had. It
Mm-hmm.
was a roll racing and drag racing event.
Mm-hmm.
Did it out there, did probably 10 or 11 passes that day. And that's when the head really started lifting at that point, and we were
Yeah.
spraying coolant out under boost. So obviously, that was my fault. I hit launch control way too hard. I did a burnout to heat up the tires, and at the end of the day, it was my fault on that one. So
Okay.
the head gasket wasn't bad enough to where it would overheat though. So I drove the car home, which
Mm-hmm.
was an hour and a half away from the track.
Wow.
Put it in my shop. I was like, all right, I'll deal with this next week. And that's when I got back to it and I started tearing it down. And that's when I saw obviously the head gasket had blown out, but I didn't know that the valves were messed up until the machine shop called me like 2 or 3 days after dropping the heads off.
Right.
Because
Right.
I was going to put it back together. I bought the tool to O-ring the block to make sure it would hold more boost. And then once
Mm-hmm.
I got that call, that's when I was like, I'm pulling the plug on this. I was like, this will have been the third or fourth time I've had to rebuild these heads completely, and I'm getting less than 1,000 miles per engine.
Right. Right. Okay. Did you enjoy it when it was working?
Oh,
Was
I
because
loved it.
okay. It finally like checked all those boxes for at least a little bit of time. Like it was just like, yes, this is all working.
Yeah, I absolutely loved it. And I drive it around. I drive it around on the street every now and then, and like everyone else loved it too. I had a
Oh, for
blast driving
sure.
it. It was responsive. it would come into, even with the massive turn, because we had a precision 7675 on there, and
Hmm.
even with the 7675, it would already be in boost at 4500 RPM. So it's not like that setup was laggy or anything like that.
Yeah.
So it would come on, it would still come on pretty quick. So it was responsive, it was fun. It didn't feel too nose heavy either.
Hmm.
And it just felt like in EJ, but with a better power band.
Right. Right. So
I
it
mean,
so it did feel good.
that's essentially what it
Yeah.
was.
So you've talked through what happened to make you go, all right, that's it. How long did you have to sit and to come to that conclusion? Was it a quick decision or
Oh
was
no,
it
it was
something
like 2 weeks.
2 weeks?
It
Okay.
was like 2 weeks. I was going back and forth. I was like, do I rebuild it again? If I rebuild it again, is something else going to happen shortly after? I was like, do I cut my ties now and go to something else that has more support? Because the big thing that I was looking at is, as I've been doing this build and this swap, I've watched Subaru continue to discontinue more and
Yeah.
more and more and more parts. So I'm like, at one point, I'm going to keep dumping so much more money into this engine. I'm not going to be able to get the OE quality parts that I need to put it back together. Like, granted, there are some third party ones, but even there, it's like scarce pickings for stuff.
Yeah.
So I'm
Yeah.
like, it was not an easy decision for me to be like, all right, I'm gonna pull the plug on it. It felt like I took like this child that I had made, and then I just like threw it off a cliff. I was like, I'm done
Yeah.
with you. So
I mean you got it to the point where you got to enjoy it for long enough that you finally got to play with this thing that you've been trying to create and make work for just long enough that like now you know what it can be. And that
yeah,
that, that had to be a hard decision to kind of decide, all right, I'm going to walk away from this. I'm going to start over.
it was not easy, but there's also, I have to also be realistic about it, because I'm like, I'm spending so much money rebuilding this engine every
Hmm.
1,000 miles, like just for the full. Because the only thing that technically, if I really wanted to get the car back together and back running again, all it needed was a rebuild of the cylinder heads, O-ringing the
Hmm.
block, and a new head gasket. All in all, I could probably get all that for $5,000, but it's like I'm spending this every sub 1,000 miles, and I'm like,
Yeah.
it's for me to get the car where it needed to be reliably. Like I said, I needed a dry sump, which daily engineering makes a dry sump for it. But
Hmm.
after paying for the dry sump, paying for the custom fab I need, paying for everything else that goes into a dry sump, I'm looking at $10,000 to $12,000 on top of that also. So
Yeah.
it's like, do I want to dump another $20,000 into this for something that still could go wrong after that?
Yeah. Well, then it sounds like what you're saying and kind of reading between the lines is that you got to that point where you got to drive the car and it was like somewhat reliable, but
Mm-hmm.
then other things happened and you kind of know what the next fix is for the issues that you had right now,
Yeah.
but the oiling is still an issue. And getting that installed and functioning, how complicated is that? And then what's the next thing? It's not like it's just turnkey, go out there and rip and there's no concerns. There's a feeling that there's going to be still more problems to solve the more you drive it, the more
Yeah.
the more you continue to use the car.
And don't get me wrong, there's other people out there with EG setups that are doing it, and they're still doing it. I know there's my buddy Kevin down in Australia. I talk to him quite frequently. He has an EG also,
Mhm.
but he runs an external oil pump on that thing. He is a
Okay.
custom made external oil pump, and he's pretty solid on that. He has a
Mhm.
80 85 on there. I don't know how much power
Wow.
he's making on that thing. There's a couple people over in, I don't know. It's somewhere in one of the Nordic countries.
Oh, yeah.
They're doing it also, but it's like here in the US, it's like there's not a whole lot of people like
Yeah.
making, like pushing these to the absolute limit of like what they're doing. So I know
Yeah.
there's people out there doing it. It's just I don't
Yeah.
I know some of them have spent a lot more than me also.
Sure, sure. Well, and I mean that's something maybe to factor in is just, if you look out there at the landscape,
Mhm.
you kind of know where you know where you want to head. How many people in out there in the world on the internets are doing what you're doing so that you have, people you can, get information from, bounce ideas off of. Hey, I'm having this issue. Did you run into this? Have you solved it
Mhm.
or not? And like if you have a platform that has like very little uh, participation out there in the world to solve these problems, that you kind of have to figure all that stuff out on your own,
Well,
which can be a challenge.
the thing I find funny about it is there's like a handful of us doing it. And
Mhm.
out of that handful, there were good people there who would share information, and we would
Mhm.
all share information as we found it out. And then there was like a subset of those people that wouldn't tell you anything.
Mm,
And I'm like, why would you not share the information you have with the small group of people who are trying to do it and
yeah,
just work together as, I guess, an EG33 community? For the people
yeah,
that did work together, share information, they were awesome. They were absolutely awesome to work with. And they're killer people who everybody just wanted to see everyone else's car
yeah,
succeed. But then
yeah,
there's always like that one gatekeeper group who's like, I'm not telling you any of this.
yeah. It happens. It's out there. It's a thing.
Yeah.
Yeah. So let's look forward.
Mm-hmm.
How does everything that you've experienced with the six cylinder swap and the STI, how does that now inform what you're thinking of doing with either like the RX-7, maybe even or the Porsche or anything else? Like is it something like now you have a whole new set of kind of like criteria to decide like what direction you're going to go with these new projects?
I mean, not too much. Like with the RX-7, like that car, I'm not gonna shoot for the moon in that car. Like I
Mm,
just want to make it like a super clean looking RX-7 that makes like 500-600 wheel. I mean, it's already a built rotary. It's got single turbo conversion, all that stuff. So with that one, not too much. It's just kind of piece it back together and enjoy that car. The 911, that one will probably be one that kind of takes shape from what I've learned over all this stuff next year because that one I'm pulling that thing completely apart.
hmm,
I'm going to do somewhat similar what I did with the STI and the six cylinder and that over to the 911 because I can build super engines now. I understand how to do it. I do my own. I do them for other people every now and then, and I want to be able to do that with like the 911 stuff. So I'm
mm,
gonna try to move everything I've learned from doing this in the six cylinder and transplant it over to the 911 because it's also funny the 911 if you take that Mesger engine and you put it next to an EG33, they resemble each other so closely. It is wild. I mean, the main difference is the 911 comes with factory dry sump, so there's no wet sump or oil pan on the bottom of it or anything like that. But if you
hmm,
were just to kind of ignore that factor, they look so similar from one to the other. It's insane.
yeah. Yeah, Subaru's definitely been paying attention to what Porsche's been doing for a long time.
I
And
do think this is a little bit off topic, but I think it's a
mhm,
little bit interesting since we're talking about the Subaru Porsche stuff. Um, it's wild. Like with the 911, they have like their case halves where the crank sits, and then they have another piece that bolts onto the case halves where the like the cylinders and the sleeves go. So
mhm,
you can change rods and pistons without having to take the crank or anything out.
mhm.
It's so odd.
That probably maybe is partly related to the old air-cooled engines because they're the cylinders, bolted
Yep.
onto this intersection. But two, like Porsche, I don't know a lot about Porsche engineering, but like racing is such a big part of their heritage and
Mhm.
like all different forms of racing, like endurance racing, sprint racing, you name it. Like there's so many different racing series that Porsches compete in, and I feel like especially with the 911 platform that that's a big piece of design criteria for the 911 that like people that are campaigning these in whatever series, like can they, especially because endurance racing is just something that Porsche has been doing forever.
Yeah,
That
and it's
how
cool with them because all their race car stuff trickles down into
mhm,
their consumer car stuff
yeah,
too.
yeah. It's going to be really interesting because Porsche has a huge community of enthusiasts. I think my sense of it is there's different camps of the Porsche enthusiast group, but it
Yeah,
is one of the like the higher end cars, the exotic cars, if you will, where a lot of the owners are into modifying and changing the cars more than others. Like some of them, everything has to be like completely original. With Porsche, like modifying cars is much more done and much more accepted than many of these other platforms.
oh yeah,
So it's going to be interesting how different it is, or
yeah.
or, or similar.
I've seen both similarities and differences from like the Porsche community over to the Subaru community. It's a little more on the Porsche side of things, all about option codes, OEM options, don't modify the cars. I'm like, they're meant to be, don't drive the cars either.
Yeah.
I drove mine in this like a little blizzard we had. I drive it in the
Hmm.
rain. It's like their cars meant to be driven. I just don't understand the whole aspect where people are like, just keep them in the garage, only drive them up to
Yeah.
the
Yeah. Way
different
back in the
mindsets.
day, there was advertising pictures of 911s with skis on the back, like going up
Mhm.
to the French Alps and stuff like that. They were designed to be driven and used, and things
Yeah,
have changed a little bit. Yeah,
gotta enjoy them.
yeah. Well, very cool. Yeah, it's one of those like you've come so far down this path, like you've got probably a better perspective than many of us do as far as like where. what is a good direction to go and what is not a good direction to go if you're going to try and do these engine swaps and stuff. And so definitely wanted to pick your brain about that. With all that said, you in the last video, I believe you left it open where there was two possibilities that you were kind of thinking about.
Now there's 4.
Now there's 4. Okay, well,
Now there's 4.
so originally it was an FA24, and then you mentioned a Coyote engine, which, having seen a Coyote engine like in some of these open wheel cars, that is huge. That is a big engine.
It is.
But
which is now why there's 4 options.
Okay, so let's set that aside. What are the other 2 now?
So one of the options is go back to an EJ, which obviously I feel like that would be a step backwards though from where I just was.
Okay.
And then, as sacrilegious and as much as it'll make people mad, I'm also considering an LS.
Oh, an LS. Okay, so two 8-cylinders back to an EJ and the FA24. Wow, that's some variety right there.
I'm trying to avoid. A lot of people are suggesting inline 6 engines, 2JZs, RB26s, that type of stuff, and I'm trying to avoid doing a straight 6 just because they're so long. You have to modify the firewall, and it's not worth cutting up a car like that.
Or the nose of the car, like let it stick out the front.
Yeah. The only so I was pulling measurements yesterday for like the Coyote swap because I was like, what if I can keep it all-wheel drive? I can't keep it all-wheel drive. You put a V8 in that car, it's so hard unless you go to a different drivetrain altogether, like a R34 GTR style or something along those lines. It's just not going to happen without pushing the engine completely over the core support.
Have you seen what Sam Albert has done with his Ferrari California engine swap into his STI?
I've seen it, but I haven't looked into it too much.
Okay, because that is all-wheel drive. It is still bolted to the STI transmission.
Is it? See, here's the thing. How far forward does the engine sit?
What he said is that so he had to relocate the radiator. So the front of the engine is basically right where the end of the radiator would be, and then he had to relocate all of the cooling to the trunk.
I mean, that's similar to how my EG setup was, because my EG with the pulley on there ended where the factory radiator would sit.
Okay.
So we cut the core support and we pushed the radiator underneath the core support. Obviously, no AC, so we were able to make it all fit. But there was maybe 3 millimeters clearance between my radiator and my pulley. So I was like, because that was the thing I was looking at. I pulled measurements with like the Coyote, if I were just because I found a company in Australia who makes adapter plates and flywheels to be able to make these engines up to the STI driveline. But with the thickness of the adapter plate and with where the engine would be, it wouldn't make the car drive nicely. I feel like having that much weight over the front axle that far, that I feel like just driving the car, because what I want from this next swap is I don't want just an engine that's going to be in there and make a whole bunch of power. I still want the car to handle well. So I would like the engine to still be tucked back near the firewall, as centered or as far behind or centered over the front axle where it would be, I guess, as I could. But my only compromise with that then is swap to an entirely different drivetrain or go rear wheel drive, which I'm not opposed to going rear wheel drive. Honestly, it doesn't bother me too much if it was all wheel drive or rear wheel drive. So that's kind of where I'm at with like the V8 stuff. So I'm still taking measurements, still kind of pondering it. The EJ, that's easy drop in. We know how to do EJs. I put an EJ back because the way that I did this swap with the EG is I built it in a way where if I wanted to go back to an EG, I could, or an EJ, I could.
Okay.
So if I wanted to, I could put an EJ back in there. And I mean, honestly, I could make the same power on an EJ that I was making with the EG, no problem. We know how to do it. We know the parts that are needed. It's not an issue. The FA is one that I'm considering as well, but that one I'm doing more digging into to see where the aftermarket's at with it, what people are planning on releasing for it, because I can already foresee the problem that I'm going to run into with an FA24, and that is going to be the same problems that the FA20 ran into.
Okay.
I did find out, I think you and I were talking about this. I found out Link is supporting the FA24 stuff. If they are not already, then soon, from what I've heard. So it won't just be like a Motec only option. And a lot of people want to see the FA24 done in a way because they want to see like people break past the fueling barriers and all this stuff. But if I do that, it's not something that 95% of people are going to do because it's going to cost so much money. So
Initially,
it's like
for sure, yeah.
Yeah, so it's like I could do this FA24 swap and I could make the power, but it's going to be so expensive. No one else is going to do it.
Right. And this is related to the direct injection system. So this is where the link comes up, because the Haltech does not support direct injection, so you'd have to go to a different standalone that would support direct injection. And then direct injection just by itself, there's not a whole lot of aftermarket support as far as other injectors or any other of the other go-to parts that you would need, like bigger injectors and
Yeah,
fuel pump.
and then you run into like high pressure fuel pump issues. I
Yeah,
don't think Nordstrom has released an aftermarket high pressure fuel pump yet for the FA24 setup,
yeah,
because on those stock pressure pumps you can run full E85, but you're not supposed to.
right,
You're not
right.
supposed to run full E85 on the stock high pressure fuel pumps. You can do like E30, E60. I think E60 is kind of where like the limit is supposed to be, but
Yeah,
it's like you're not supposed to do this stuff. And that's like the great thing and the bad thing about direct injection is the direct injection will make power so easy up until the direct injectors are capped. And then after that, you're just
yeah.
it's
And
add port injection.
yeah, and it's all new. So there like to the original point of support, like there's just not a lot out there. So you have to either be the guy that's willing to blaze the trail and work with the company to make, whatever might be needed, pistons, rods, I mean, you name it. And again, like thinking about the horizon, like there's not a lot of people that are out there running those engines at really high power levels. So there's kind of some unknowns as far as what those limitations might be that you would then hit, like with oiling. Is oiling
Yeah.
going to be significantly better with the FA24 than it was with the EG33?
Mm-hmm.
Not 100% sure. Really,
Because see,
there's
but I mean, the FA20 at this point has been out for what, 10 years,
mhm.
and you don't see really any high horsepower FA20s. Like I mean, like there's high horsepower ones, but I'm like
Yeah,
high like 800 plus horsepower
very few.
FA20. You just don't see them out there.
Yeah, yeah,
And I have even though the FA24 has slightly more displacement, I feel like it's going to run into the same problems. So it's like before, that's why I haven't bought an engine yet, or I haven't decided on what I want to do, is because I don't know what support or where this stuff is going. So it's like I'm trying to narrow that down before I'm like, all right, this is the setup, this is what we're doing, this is what we're going with. Like with the V8 stuff, like we can make a V8 fit, we can make power.
yeah.
We know how to do that. People have been doing it for a long time. But it's like at the same time, in my mind, I'm also like, do I want to do something that's again a little bit out of the box and different? And then it goes back to like what support is out there for like these weird engines that not everyone's
Yeah.
using. And it's just
There's like having like a it in what you're saying is exactly, it's like the summation of what we've talked about. It's like if you're going to blaze new trail, you have to be willing to put in the work and try new things and know that it's not going to go quickly. And there might be just some waiting involved versus that's the advantage of having a tried and tested platform
yeah.
that you can just like I mean for a V8 engine, like, oh, you want to make 1,000 horsepower, that's it.
Yeah.
Like there's multiple ways to do it, and like so there's a lot of support and a lot of the issues, especially like with the Coyote engine, because they've been around so long, like things are pretty well sorted at this point. Like
Mhm.
there's not you're not going to run into a lot of surprises.
Yeah, that's
Um,
why I'm like, do I want a problem-free experience?
yeah,
Do I want to build this car so it doesn't have nearly as many problems as it did before? That's
yeah,
where it would be like LS, Coyote, EJ25.
yeah,
Those are all proven platforms. We
yeah.
can make them fit in there. We can make them work. It's not a problem. And then that's where like the FA24 comes in. So it is still newer and nobody's pushed it as far as like I want to go with this stuff.
Hmm.
It's pay to play, unfortunately. Like that
Yeah,
at the end of the day, that's what it is. It's pay to play.
yeah, yeah. Well, and it's one of the questions that we've kind of had and we've discussed around the shop is why did they leave the EJ engine in the STI for so long? Why
Mm-hmm.
is it that when the WRX got the FA20, why did they stick with the EJ right up until at the end? And I still adamantly of the opinion that it's because there was the infrastructure, there was the aftermarket support. You could from 2004 to 2021, you could buy an STI with an EJ engine, and you had access to all of the different packages and modification paths to make that STI into whatever you wanted it to be. If they would have moved into the direct injected engine with the STI, the aftermarket would have had probably like 2 years at least to really develop parts, maybe a year and a half, to really
Yeah.
come out with some options just as a start, and then we have to build from there.
Mm-hmm.
Um, Now the downside is I think the converse is true because they didn't go to the direct injected engine in the STI. That's also one of the reasons why the support for the WRX to make that much power just has been slow to develop because everybody that really wanted to make big power, they stuck with the STI because that's the known platform.
Yeah,
That's
like
the
we
known,
have the recipe to do it. Buy these
yeah,
parts, bolt them on, you're
yeah,
good to go.
yeah. How much of a change do you think there's been those paths with the EJ engine since you started to now, which would be like what, 4 years, 5 years,
It's
give or
been like
take?
4, 3.5, 4, somewhere in that
Yeah,
range. Like the advancements with the EJ stuff,
yeah,
it's become easier to make power.
yeah.
Like at the end of the day, it's just become easier to make power with the EJs. Like sadly, I can make more power with an EJ and like give me a week, give me a car with no engine in it. I'll put it together. If I have all the parts on hand, I can make an EJ make more power than I made with the EG, no problem.
Hmm.
Like no problem at all. We could do it. We know how to do it. We have the parts to do it. We order the parts. We get the parts. There's nothing that has to be custom made. You can literally order everything off the shelf and it'll all
Right,
work and bolt up.
right.
So I mean, it's gotten easier to make. And some people will probably disagree with me, but I think that the EJ is probably, with the infrastructure that's already been built out and everything that's there. I think the EJ is the greatest engine from Subaru right now. If you want to make power, if you want to do
Hmm.
road course, if you want to do time it, there's so much support for it already there. It's
It's
like
true.
it's in my opinion, if you're looking at building a Subaru, the EJ is the way to go.
Yeah, I mean the aftermarket support is very, very strong, and like when they're running it in rally, like there's still some parts that are still derived from what ProDrive sorted out years and
Yeah.
years ago. Um, yeah, that's a good point. I would agree with that statement. Just just because it has the most motorsports heritage and whatnot. The one interesting caveat. I don't know if you've noticed this. So every year Subaru runs an STI, or until I guess it was last year, an STI in the 24 hours of Nürburgring challenge.
Mhm.
And then they switched, I believe it was last year, to a WRX, and it is the FA24 platform.
Mhm.
So they are starting to kind of move to do some kind of motorsports use for that FA24, um, which I thought was interesting, and maybe hopefully a sign of things to come. I think
Here's
Subaru's going to go a little bit in that direction.
here's my concern with that though, is that another concern why I'm not jumping headfirst into an FA24 right now is Subaru's already announced that they're trying to go away from internal combustion and they're trying to
Mhm.
go more towards EV. So it's like, how long are they really even going to support this engine with them doing the FA24 stuff? Like they may be doing it for
Mm,
1, 2, 3 years, but if they've already announced that they're pushing everything towards electric, it's like, why are they going to continue to put the R&D and the time into an FA24 when it's a temporary engine and they're going into an
yeah.
electrification process? So it's like, is there even a future for this engine with Subaru, or is it just a temporary engine that they're putting in stuff right now?
Hmm.
That's
No,
more EPA compliant than an EJ was.
yeah. Interesting point. As we're recording this, I don't know if you've seen this, but they actually put out a press release today that the production of the Legacy is officially stopping next year.
No
So,
way.
so as of at the end of 2025, there is not going to be a
That's
Legacy.
insane because the legacy's been around forever.
Yeah, since I'm sorry, 89, I
At
think,
88,
89,
89, I
90,
think, somewhere
something
in
like
that.
that. Yeah, like 35 years, and they're the reason that they said this is because one, the demand for sedans is less. Everybody wants like crossovers and SUVs,
Mhm.
and because they're looking to move more in the direction of electrification. So
See,
yeah,
it's like how long are they even going to support the FA24 stuff? Which is why I'm like, do I even want
yeah,
to spend the money and the time trying to push the FA24 if it's a temporary engine for Subaru, kind of like how the
yeah,
FA20 was?
yeah. It's man, it's a weird spot to be in, you know. Um, at least with like something like Porsche,
Hmm.
they are still supporting, their combustion engine cars. I don't, they're coming up with electric options for them, but it's
Yeah.
not, it's not like they're completely walking away from them. Um, and Subaru's just not as big of a company as Porsche, I don't think, or at least they don't have the big parent company that Porsche does, so that they have as many options.
The Volkswagen just needs to pick up Subaru. We'll be fine.
Well, Toyota's already like reasonably invested in
Well, yeah, they
Subaru.
got like what, 20% in
Hmm.
Subaru right now?
Yeah. So, man, yeah, it is what I mean. Have you thought maybe, or started to think 5 years down the future, like
Mhm.
what things are going to be like? Do you have any idea?
For
Just
For
just cars in general and car culture and tuning options.
I think older older Japanese cars, older USDM cars, older European cars are going to be way more in demand, especially as more electronics, more nannies, all this other stuff gets put in. I don't know how accurate it is. I remember seeing a bill that was proposed by the government, I want to say it was last year, that they wanted to put every new vehicle produced after like 2025 or something like that with an electronic shutoff that they could use in newer cars for if someone's like running from the police or things like that. And I think
Mhm.
if these stricter laws continue to be put on, like security, EPA, more driver assists, all this stuff, I think it's only going to drive up the cost of older cars even more because they're easier to work on. There's less
Yeah.
assists in them. There's less electronics. There's less crap in the
Yeah.
cars. So I think that all these older cars are just going to keep going up.
Mm.
And
Yeah.
all these newer ones, people will buy them, they'll enjoy them for a while, but I don't think they're going to be cars that people keep long term like people do now with vehicles. I think they're going to be more on like that lease aspect of things where I'll get this
Mm.
car on a lease for 3 years, get rid of it because this isn't something I want to keep forever.
Yeah. It's I think you drive a car, you like the car, it's something that you're going to keep in just daily drive and you're fine with that. But if it's something that you want to tinker with, the more they bring electronic systems
It makes it
and
harder.
overrides in, it makes it more challenging.
It makes it like if you
Yeah.
wanted to going back to like for example, like engine swaps in Subarus, you want to engine swap like a GD chassis, way easier than like a
Yeah.
VA.
Yeah.
If granted, when I did my VA, the support for the CAN system wasn't there fully,
Right.
so I had to make things work a little bit differently. But it's like the older a car is, the easier it is to do whatever you want with it, tinker with it,
Yeah.
swap it, do electronics in it. The more integrated these newer cars get, and I said this in the last video that I made also with like new tips for new Subaru owners when they go buy, is a lot of people go buy these cars that are like CVTs and then they'll ask me if they can manual swap. I'm like, no. I'm like
Yeah.
the CAN system is so integrated at this point to the transmission, to the body
Yep.
control module, to the ECMs, to all this stuff that it's not as simple as it used to
Yeah.
be, where you just take this
It's
out, put this in, and you're
yeah.
good.
Yeah. Well, not only that, but so have you seen that? So 2024 is the first year where all WRXs and all BRZs are coming standard with eyesight.
Mm-hmm.
And the significance of what that means is that means that there's going to be some kind of override that's connected to the steering in both of these cars. There's not an option to get one that doesn't have that steering override and braking override.
Yeah.
And that's in part because that those kind of security systems are going to become mandatory here in a couple of years. And so Subaru is kind of like preemptively putting them in place.
It also
Um,
makes working on the car like more expensive. Like if you need
yeah.
a windshield, way more expensive for
Oh,
a car
yeah.
with eyesight versus like non. So I mean, it drives up cost for people. It reduces what people can do. I mean, I'm sure to a point, what I foresee happening is they're going to come out with some type of tuning thing that will eliminate or allow you to delete like steering overrides and things like
Mm.
that. Then the government's going to come in and say, no, you can't do this anymore. And then it's going to be like the EPA and tuning scandal all over again, but with like safety equipment in cars that manufacturers are adding in.
Could. Yeah. Yeah. And just like what I wonder about is fixing those, well, changing those systems. Like if there's this electronic override that steers the car, like how much of an effect is like something even as simple as putting a more motorsports oriented alignment on,
Mm-hmm.
or something where, you've got like toe out instead of toe in, or zero toe instead of toe in, or more aggressive camber. Like what if, it's programmed to give you like 3 degrees of steering correction, but it does that, but now it has more of an impact, and then will it be able to adapt? I don't know. It's just there's when you turn the thing over to computer overrides, it's like changing it might have even more of an impact with that because the computer won't know what you're doing or
Yeah.
wouldn't know what
And
you're
then when
doing.
you try to, because I know a lot of us like to tinker. If you try to remove that stuff and replace it for something else, then it makes all these other systems in
Go
the
into limp
can
mode.
unhappy, and then it causes more problems. So it's
Yeah.
like it just becomes more and more difficult the newer that these cars get, which is why that's why like all the older car prices nowadays are just like they just keep going up for any desirable old car that people want.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, this is where it's so frustrating that Subaru's discontinuing parts. And I understand it because I think in their mindset, they're thinking, well, like the one that's wild to me is you think about the 2-liter WRX. At
Mm-hmm.
this point, the newest 2-liter WRX is 19 years old. Next year, it'll be 20 years since you could get a 2-liter in the WRX over here.
Yeah.
And so I'm sure that they're trying to kind of move the dollars that they would put on the shelf for those kind of parts for a 20-year-old car and get ready for the stuff that is going to be these new cars, which are going to be entirely different that they'll have to support because
Yeah. And I mean,
people
on
buying
like
them.
the manufacturing side of things, like I get it where Subaru comes from with that kind of stuff. Like when it comes to like castings get worn out,
Hmm.
and it doesn't make sense for them to amortize a new casting out for the same part that they've been making for the past 20 years. They're like, all right, we're going to spend $80,000, for example, on a new
Yeah,
casting. And then we're going to have to try to amortize that out over the next like 30 years. They probably just won't make their money back on it at that point
yeah,
because there's so many of these cars less out there at this point from being crashed, parted out, destroyed, unregistered, just left dying somewhere. So like I
yeah,
get it where Subaru comes from with it, but on like the enthusiast side, the few of us who like buy these cars that are like a niche car, it
yeah.
makes it way more difficult to like. That's one of the reasons why I was like I can't keep doing this with the EG. I was like it just makes it
Hmm.
way more difficult.
Yeah. And just expensive. I mean,
Mm-hmm.
because it's more challenging. There's less people that are going to be willing to spend the time and the money and the energy to continue to modify the cars in that way. And so then it's kind of like the cost is likely to continue to grow
Yeah.
just because the market support is going to continue to shrink. It's looking forward. I mean, I'm really hopeful that there's going to be some kind of a transition where there's something else as an enthusiast to get excited about. And there's like a couple little glimmers of hope. Um,
I mean,
but
I've seen Subaru start doing that stuff for Japan. Like they have that BRZ that comes factory with like a cage you can get and
yeah,
like all the stuff like
yeah,
removed and it's just like bare bones. I was like, just
yeah,
offer that in the United States. People
yeah,
will buy them.
yeah. And it was not expensive either. I want to say it was like 20 equivalent to
I
like
think it was the
24,
cheapest
20,000.
one. Yeah, I
Yeah,
think it was like the cheapest one that they offered.
because it had nothing in it.
Yeah.
It's all
I was like,
stripped
that's
down with
what
the
we want.
cage.
Just give us that.
Yeah, yeah. I feel like as enthusiasts, yeah, it would be sure nice if Subaru would support the enthusiast base just a touch more and bring some of those options, at least make them available
Well, I feel like
to us.
Subaru over the past like 10, probably honestly since the VAs came out, I feel like Subaru started to stray away from the enthusiast aftermarket side and they've started pushing more towards the A to B cars, the econo boxes, things like that. And they're not where they used to be with their I guess like enthusiast WRX STI, Forcer XT, Outback
Yeah,
XT support because Subaru back in the day, they're all EJ25. They were turbocharging everything. Didn't matter the car. EJ25 turbo and this, that,
yeah,
Bajas, Outbacks, Foresters, and they even provided like OEM options for after like SPT intakes,
hmm,
all this other stuff that they just don't offer any of that anymore. Which I
yeah,
get, like a lot of it has to do with more strict EPA laws coming into effect, and they can't offer it a lot of it, so it makes it a little bit more difficult for them to try and support it. Which now they just do like all the STI garnish it. You can get a cross
yeah,
track with an STI wing and all this weird stuff like that now.
yeah,
So like
yeah,
I feel like they're trying to appeal where they can, but it's not the same Subaru that we used to know.
yeah. That's true. I guess, do you think that something like the Wilderness editions is maybe it's a completely different direction, but it is still, again, a glimmer of hope that Subaru it is still trying to keep enthusiasts in mind, albeit in a different direction,
Yeah.
because you don't have all the other implications just by raising the car up that you would by, say, putting on, you know, or doing anything that would make more power. It,
I mean, I feel like they're trying where they can,
mhm,
but the way they're going about it might be a little bit off. Like
mhm.
I've seen it. I know they did it as an April Fool's joke, but like they did like a BRZ wilderness. Everyone
Oh
wants
yeah,
that, but
yeah,
they won't give the people what they want.
yeah,
Like everyone here wants the Lavorgs.
yeah,
Everyone's been screaming for Lavorgs for years, and Subaru just won't give us that in the USA. So I feel like
yeah,
they're trying to appeal to someone, but I don't think they're listening to their actual market fully. And they're just like, we're gonna do this and we're gonna do that, and
yeah.
we'll
I
just see how it plays out.
I'm going to reveal that obviously we were digging through Subaru news releases because this is the other crazy thing we found out today. Subaru is releasing the Lavorg in Mexico,
See, they won't give it us here. They won't give us here.
which is, I mean, we when we saw that it was just, and not only that, but there's also they're going to be a WRX wagon in Mexico,
But they won't give it to us.
and they
And
won't give it
people
to
have
us.
wanted one since 2015 when they stopped doing them.
And it's I think to anybody that's still watching and listening, hashtag below, hashtag give us the Lavorg.
Well, that's all we want.
That's all we want. And
I
why I just don't understand why they don't do it. I don't understand it.
I would buy one in a heartbeat if they brought Lavorgs over here.
Yeah, they
I
have
would
it.
I would go to
It
the extent
exists.
I would go to the extent of doing what Mighty Car Mods did as well. I would swap a Lavorg. I would do that.
Yeah,
I like
yeah,
the Lavorgs, but they just won't give it to us.
yeah. It's weird. Uh, I wonder. So yeah, wonder what the logistics are going to be of getting something in Mexico and then bringing it back over.
Watch, they're going to be like, it's 25 years. You're going to have to wait 25
Well,
years.
I
But
know.
unless it's like Canada where they can just drive them in. So
Well, I've seen people occasionally because we are not close to the Mexico border, but every now and then I will see somebody that's got a Mexico plate with. I want to say there was like a couple of years ago somebody had a Skoda that they had
mhm.
driven up because they were in the market in Mexico and they'd driven it up here. They were driving it
I'm
around
sure
and
we'll see them
yeah,
start to trickle up, but I don't think that we'll legally be able to like register and own them.
yeah, man. All right. So let's see. As we're winding down here, Tanner, anything else on the future that you want to kind of tell people to keep an eye out for, or anything that you're excited about doing?
I mean the STI is kind of like the main thought right now with what I'm doing. The
Okay.
full 911 build will probably be coming like this winter fall. So tear that engine completely down. I'll build my own motor for it. We're gonna do custom fab on it. So we'll do twin, probably Garrett turbos on that one. So we'll
Okay.
do twin Garretts. I'll because normally I do like precisions and stuff like that. So I'll probably try some Garretts. We'll do some smaller twin Garretts and
Hmm.
turn that thing up and kind of figure out the limitations of that because that car technically is also it's still EPA compliant. Like I built an
Hmm.
X pipe for it. It's got Gessie cats and everything. So
Hmm.
technically, and I have an access port for it. So it'll still be using Cobb software to be able to tune it. So kind of see how far I can push that one. RX-7 is like a
Nice.
leisurely build one that I'm just kind of doing whenever I get some free time. So that one's just like the fun weekend car that you've always wanted that you just kind of putz around in and drive when
Oh
it's
yeah.
nice outside. So I you never see them anymore, and I've
No,
always wanted one. So this is like the perfect opportunity to just build like the perfect clean example of one that I want.
for sure. Yeah, I mean that's definitely one of those in the pantheon of just like dream JDM muscle cars.
Right. And
Yeah.
they're like we were talking about earlier, they're just wildly expensive now.
Yeah. To find one with like that's clean and good condition. Yeah, it's crazy.
The left hand drive ones are just they're so you can get right hand drive ones pretty affordable, but the left hand
Mhm.
drive ones are all just wild now. I mean, even for that one with a blown up engine that sat for 10 years, I still think I paid 20,000 for it,
Whoa, and it's sat
which
for
is
10 years?
sat for yeah, I mean it sat inside of a garage,
Okay,
thankfully,
okay.
so it wasn't just outside.
Okay. Not a
But
barn find exactly, but
no, it was
okay.
someone's forgotten project car that they left in the garage.
Sure. Sure. Man, well, it'll be very cool to see that. And the best place to follow you, obviously on YouTube, Instagram, those are the best places. Excellent.
Yes.
Well, very cool. Well, Tanner, good luck. I'm very curious to see what your next path is with this engine swap. I'm curious.
I mean, Subaru made a flat. What was it? 12. Keeping an eye
Yeah.
out for that thing to pop up.
Okay.
I'm not doing
Supposedly,
that. That'd be terrible.
no, no. You want to talk about no support? That is the
Right?
definition. And it was made by some company in Italy, I believe.
Very unreliable
Yeah,
engine.
good luck. Yeah. Yes. But well, very cool. Well, thanks everybody for watching. Make sure you check out Tanner on his YouTube channel. And until next time, stay tuned to Flatirons Tuning.
Thanks everyone for tuning in to the Flatiron Syndicate Motorsports Podcast. Once again, we'd like to let you know that your support is what makes this show possible. Be sure to check out our online store at flatirons.com for any of your aftermarket or OEM Subaru parts needs. And as always, stay tuned with Flatirons Tuning.